all of our archival items in the museum, and also putting on various programs. Again, you know, we couldn't survive without the city. The city and county of Broomfield have been marvelous. You know, they've provided us the whole building, the heating, lighting, anytime we've needed to make changes within the building, and it's just been marvelous. And that's the main reason we're able to have a marvelous museum and not charge admission. With the donations, our membership, and the support of the city, we've been able to keep it free. And that's our goal, you know, forever now. Yeah, well, you know, let me take that. Well, even before we get going, I want to highlight a marvelous magazine and the executive directors, James and his lovely spouse with him, the real boss, who came up with the idea of a marvelous magazine that really tells the story of our veterans. And, you know, the articles are marvelous, the photography superb. We have a bunch of copies up here of the more recent and, you know, one of the past ones. I would strongly encourage you to subscribe to this magazine. It's the only way it's going to continue to survive. And it's just, you know, the articles are great. And Flint Whitlock and others, you know, from our museum, Grady, Birdsong, and others have been contributing to this. So if you haven't seen one, we have copies up here. And if you'd like to learn more, James and his lovely wife, Mindy, are here, so talk with them as well. Just a few things here. Again, certainly make sure you've signed in. The visitor log, either upstairs or down here. It documents that people actually visit us. Good time to put your cell phone on mute. Invariably, it's going to go off. Would love you to become a museum member if you haven't already. Talk to any of us in a vest or Don here, and we gladly will help you. And certainly your donations help keep the museum going. A couple new exhibits that we have here upstairs with us approaching the 250th year of the founding of our country and the 150th anniversary for the founding of Colorado. We have a new exhibit upstairs. And there's a marvelous collection of miniature toy soldiers, which also shows how different military groups were organized. And that's up there as well. And then in the hallway, we have a collection here, visual depiction of the war by military artists. Mostly all sketches and everything, but very much capture, you know, the horrendous story and experiences of our soldiers during World War II. So that's totally new, both of those. So, you know, stick around afterwards and visit with them. Various upcoming talks. Again, quite timely. Chris Hendrickson was a tank driver, I guess, yeah, during the first Gulf War. So we're kind of setting the stage with Don's talk, and then we'll have the actual experience as someone. Quilts of Valor and Rocky Mountain Honor Flight, two different groups here who are going to talk about their programs. And for any veterans, particularly older, Vietnam or older, the honor flights are marvelous. So Rocky Mountain Honor Flight group in particular, smaller, about 20 veterans at a time with their escorts, back to DC for 2 days of touring all the marvelous monuments there. I've gone back twice as an escort, and I can tell you, it's just a marvelous experience. So if you haven't done it, might have an interest, come, and we can always help you apply for it as well. David Barrett will be back in World War II, kind of a horrendous story here, but one you need to know. And then Fred Martin will talk about his experience in interviewing Lucky McGinty, who was a waist gunner on B-17 bombers during World War II. In fact, sadly, Lucky's no longer with us, but he was one of our CNC speakers probably about 4 years ago. Okay, now we can kind of get on to what you really came here for. Again, you have a handout here which gives Don's background and experience, and really quite extensive. I first met Don about 2021 here when I think I kind of convinced him to join the museum and help us as a volunteer. So since 2021, he's been with us and has been a board member now since 2024. And as you can see, he was an Army veteran. Had served both in the Army and the Colorado National Guard. Even more impressive to me is he taught secondary school history for 20 years. Oh my God. Talk about a challenge. God.
It wasn't the Army
Yeah.
that did that. It was,
Yeah. You know, and he's a noted historian. He loves military history. As you saw here, he actually went back to the 60th anniversary celebration of the landings in Normandy, and has interviewed many, World War II veterans, and as an author, ta-da, The Christmas Battle for Bastogne, No Silent Night, and he's the co-author with Leo Barron, and it's a marvelous book. And if you become a museum member, you can check this out. And Don probably even has extra books that he would gladly sell. So again, I mean, you couldn't ask for a better person to give a military history. Also, if you notice on his article, the little summary here, he actually has his own website and blog. I mean, this guy's with it. This is, and if you call it up and he gives the website there, you could become a follower or whatever for his latest blogs, I guess you would call it.
yeah.
So,
Touch on a lot of military history. It's kind of little tidbits of military history in it. So, yeah, kind of interesting.
well,
If
and
that's your thing.
yeah, well, I think it is because you wouldn't be here if not. And just the last thing to remind any of you, if you're kind of new here, Bob Mulder, former board member, marvelous gentleman, has the most extensive Civil War collection of artifacts that you could probably in Colorado, even beyond. And it's all in his basement. And he loves to have people come out and just visit, and he can tell you all the stories about everything. He knows the history, the provenance for everything he has there. And extensive, everything from uniforms to weapons to models to everything. So we have copies of this pinned up on the board there upstairs. If at all you think you might like to visit, or bring a friend, bring a nephew, bring a young person, he would love to have you come by. All you need to do is just call him in advance to make sure he's there. So I think that is about it.
Mike, can I add one
Yes.
thing to your
Uh-huh.
say about Con? I'm Bear Owen.
Yeah.
Former land reporter. During the recent school shooting in Evergreen, Con and his wife was adjacent to that school. And the kids running out of school, the teachers, refugees in his garage aren't 9mm. Protected down.
Well,
Not a joke.
no, sadly.
Protected down. It was in the paper. Until the law enforcement people. So kudos to Don
Yeah,
for that.
yeah. Okay, Don, are you turned on?
Take your, your,
Oh, yes, yeah, you need that, yeah.
Go.
Are you green there?
Now we are. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks for mentioning that, Bear. That's, Evergreen, the little community I live in. There's been, a lot of trauma going on there, and that was at least where I felt like I could play some sort of role. And I think that it was an interesting situation because I think my wife kind of fell back on her nursing background. And I fell back on both my background in the military and my background as a teacher, as an educator. And so it kind of shows, no matter how old you get, no matter how long in the teeth you are, that those skills that we learn when we're younger, they come back sometimes, and they're helpful. So I was glad I was able to do something to help ease those kids and to protect them, because it was a pretty scary situation at that point. We didn't know if that shooter was walking right up to our house or what. So some people say, that when I chose to grab a handgun, that might have been an overreaction, but I felt at that time, if this guy was going to try and get those kids, he was going to have to go through me first. That was my feeling. So, yeah.
How many kids, Don?
We had about 18 and 2 adults. So, yeah, so it was about 20 people there. Yeah. Anyway, moving on to something else, and especially with the news today, right?
Oh, yeah.
Holy cow. So 35 years ago, and this is an interesting aspect for me, especially with the events that occurred today. But I hope you won't be sorely disappointed. I am not going to touch on what's going on in Iran right now, because we really don't know at this point. It's very early. It's going to take a while before we fully know the repercussions of what is happening here with this attack on Iran and the Iranians attacking Israel and some of our bases in the Gulf. But it is the same region, right? Geographically speaking, we're talking about the Persian Gulf. So there may be some corollaries here. We'll see. I'll let you guys kind of make some of that decision as you see this presentation. The other thing, too, is I'm really not going to, I hope you're not disappointed, I'm not going to speak about my background in the service, because I played such a small, little, tiny, insignificant role in Desert Storm in the first Gulf War. I was fulfilling the end of my service contract, and that was part of with the National Guard, 2 years in the National Guard. Our unit was activated. I did public information dissemination within the military and without public affairs outside of the military. We worked at the NTC, National Training Center. Some of you are familiar with that, Fort Irwin, California. Out in the Mojave Desert, they were training forces for deployment to Saudi Arabia for Desert Storm. What was interesting about that is I got a crash course in armor doctrine. And not just United States armor doctrine, because the NTC at that time had an OPFOR, an opposition force, which modeled the Soviet military. So I got a lot of fun times crawling through Soviet vehicles that had been captured in the Middle East, and getting kind of the military intelligence point of view, how the Soviets fought. Why was that important? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that later, because this guy Saddam Hussein was basically supported by the Soviets, and his whole doctrine for his army was the same as the Soviet doctrine. So the other thing that I also am not going to go into is kind of a play-by-play as to what happened in Desert Storm. You can find that anywhere. There's plenty of great books out there. You can even just Google, a timeline of what occurred. I will touch on that a little bit, but I'm not going to go into depth of, what happened this day and what happened this day and what this strategy was and all that kind of stuff. What I'm much more interested in is, since this is the 35th, is taking a look at what this war means in retrospect. Our perspective and our context. What we've learned from the war. What went right. What went wrong. And also what it kind of means when we put it into our history today. Because 35 years is a long time. And that's why I'm kind of hesitant to discuss Iran, because you may make some observations here, you may make some connections, but 35 years is a lot of advancement in military hardware, technology, doctrine, tactics, the way our military is structured, all of that. So, yes, am I starting to feel old? Yeah. And for some of you wonderful gentlemen and ladies who were in Vietnam, can't imagine how you guys feel sometimes, but anyway. Love y'all, as you know. Yeah, and that's me and my Humvee. I always thought that'd be a good song, me and my Humvee, but anyway. All right, moving on. So yes, the questions that I always pushed my students whenever we were talking about any historical event is, you want to know, how did it happen, right? What does it mean today Why is it important? How was it successful, if it was successful? And because of that, what can we learn from this? So I'm going to break this talk up today into these 7 parts. Why Iraq invaded Kuwait, the UN-US response, Desert Shield, which was the buildup, the military leadership we had at the time, waging the war to win, the Army, the military forces we had at the time. Sorry I said Army, I'm an Army guy, but the Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Navy, everybody. Desert Storm, Desert Sabres, I said I'll touch on that. And of course, really of interest to most of us, especially veterans today, the post-war issues. Okay, and that's, hopefully we'll get around to answering this question because this has been brought up when described the first Gulf War. Was this really America's most successful war? And that's a question that will, maybe I'll let you guys kind of answer that question after you see this. All right, we know where this started. This guy right up here, you ever notice that amongst his military, it was the fashion trend to have the Hussein mustache? You ever notice that? That was kind of the thing. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, we know he ordered this invasion August 2nd, 1990. Kuwait's army, tiny little army, didn't stand a chance. Pretty much overwhelmed. Armored forces, aircraft, Iraqi troops pouring into Kuwait. Now, the Bush administration at the time, people always say, well, they were surprised by this. No, they weren't. Okay, intelligence had been taking a look at this and they knew this was coming. The problem was, what really kind of surprised us was how quickly Kuwait fell. And absolutely the fact that Hussein was emboldened by capturing all of Kuwait, so he was going to sit there and start saber rattling on the border there against Saudi Arabia and threatening the other Gulf states. That was really what kind of surprised us. So reacting to this quickly would be really important. The question always comes about, why did he do this? Some of this came about later. We actually learned the real reason, but initially we know that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait had financed much of the Iran-Iraq war. Some of you know about that war. It took place in the 1980s, a horrible kind of grinding war of attrition, very similar like the First World War, between Iran and Iraq on their border. Iraq did not have the money for paying for all of that, so there was a lot of debt that they owed Kuwait. Kuwait, a smaller country, but very wealthy because of its oil, and Saudi Arabia kind of in the same basket there too. Kuwait had traditionally been viewed as a part of Iraq, historically, called the 19th province. So I was recently in the Falkland Islands, and some of you may remember that war from back in 1982, and there was kind of a similar territorial claim there. Argentina has always claimed that these islands off the coast of Argentina historically are theirs, territorially are theirs. And Iraq did have a claim that way, way, way back, this was actually a functional part of ancient Babylon, part of Iraq. If they did gain Kuwait, of course, they would have more access to sea and offshore wells, because Kuwait does have a shoreline with the Gulf. There were accusations from Iraq that Kuwaiti was overproducing oil, so they were pushing them out of the market, and they were slant drilling. And this was actually true. Kuwait was taking the border of Iraq. They were going in and slant drilling in order to tap the Rumalia oil field, which was north of Kuwait, which was part of Iraq. So they were kind of stealing oil, if you will, from territory in Iraq. So that was actually kind of a legitimate claim. But the timing was important too. You got to take a look at Hussein for a second. Hussein's thinking to himself, I have probably my military at its peak. Now, we have often heard these claims about the Iraq military was the 4th or 5th largest in the world. And I guess you could say that if you were going to count every single bullet, every single gun, every single vehicle, every single tank, aircraft, helicopter, all of that kind of stuff. Every single one of these conscripted soldiers that was taken into this massive infantry. But really, a lot of that was ineffective. A lot of it was vehicles that were broken down. They had no extra parts. They couldn't repair them. Aircraft that were unserviceable. Troops that had like no training whatsoever. So whenever you hear that fourth or fifth largest army, maybe in numbers, but you have to take that with a grain of salt. So he's got this massive army. The other thing, too, is remember that almost all of the equipment he has purchased from the Soviet Union. Well, this is 1990. What is happening to the Soviet Union at this time? It's collapsing. It's falling apart. So Hussein's thinking to himself, I'm not going to get anything else out of the Soviet Union. It's a very good chance over the next couple of years in the future. So if I do something, I should probably act now. Also, the Western world was preoccupied with that. If you remember in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, 1990 the Soviet Union is collapsing, the United States and most of the Western countries, especially the countries in Europe, are very much focused on what's going on over there. We saw the Eastern Bloc fall apart, some of those countries in revolution like Romania. So he felt, well, their focus is so tied up with that, they're so involved in that now would be a great time to go ahead and invade Kuwait, because what are they going to do about it? They might even just let it go. World opinion. As we know, when this happened, world opinion was outraged, absolutely shocked by this. But what was really interesting was the public relations movement called Free Kuwait. Now, there had been some duplicity here. And it's something I think that later on, years later, came out about some of the testimony that came from these Kuwaitis who had been evicted out of Kuwait. Some of it was, in fact, falsified, they learned later. The story that you might remember, the little 14-year-old girl who said that she saw babies taken out of incubators by Iraqi soldiers and laid on the floor. There was no truth to that. But the duplicity lies in there were enough other atrocities. So why did this PR firm, this Knowlton and Hill, decide that they needed to exaggerate this kind of stuff? When already we did know that Iraqi soldiers were going in and they were taking Kuwaiti soldiers they had captured, and you might remember some footage where they had lined them up against the wall and just executed them. So there was enough atrocities without having to manufacture more. But this was very important. It was very impactful to the world. You might remember that also there were about 100 Westerners who were kind of stuck in Iraq at this time. British, French, even a couple of Americans. And Hussein was saying, they're my guests. Now we know they were actually, he was using them as hostages, as human shields. Do you remember this really kind of disturbing video? This young man here, Stuart Lockwood, 5-year-old British individual who, during this press conference where Hussein's trying to get across that they're his guests, he's sitting there petting his head, and it was really creepy. Yeah. The other thing, too, is that Hussein is continuing his threats to Saudi Arabia and, of course, extending that to Israel now, not just against the other Gulf states, but he's saying Israel. And we'll talk about why he was doing that. It was part of his strategy. The UN response and the United States response. Resolution 660 was passed almost immediately, condemning the invasion and basically saying Western powers have the ability to stop any further aggression from Iraq. During this time, there were diplomatic efforts. Many countries jumped in trying to head off war. Jordan, Egypt, France, even the Soviet Union was making efforts to try and stop this from becoming full-fledged war. These were fruitless, though, throughout autumn of 1990. Almost instantly, President Bush authorized Operation Desert Shield. He says we need to get troops in there immediately to help out Saudi Arabia. So build up a coalition forces on the border with Iraq. It would also create a staging point if we do decide we need to go into Kuwait and liberate Kuwait. So that was some good forethought. By October of 1990, the coalition had contributed over 50,000 troops, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of warships to the defense of Saudi Arabia. November 29th, another resolution 678 passed, and this basically gave a deadline to Hussein. January 15th said Iraq, withdraw from Kuwait, or the coalition forces can use all necessary means to liberate Kuwait after this deadline expires. So, what do we see here? Well, what we saw was multiple efforts to prevent war. Resolution 678 passed with a majority, 12-2. China abstained, and Cuba and Yemen voted against it. Believe it or not, even the Soviet Union supported it. The last time an issue of this type in the UN authorizing military action had this much support was the Korean War. In the United States, Congress authorized military action for Operation Desert Storm, so this goes locally to the United States too. And in Congress, in January 1991, PL Resolution 10743, the Senate approved it 52 to 47. The House voted 250 to 183 to pass the resolution granting the Bush administration the power to expel Iraq from Kuwait after diplomatic efforts failed. Okay, and this does tie in, if any of you know, with War Powers Resolution, which came out in 1973, how the president is responsible for action, but at the same time also responsible to reporting to Congress, okay, and getting congressional appeal. This vote marked the first time since 1964. Some of you know what happened in 1964 in the Congress, Gulf of Tonkin, right? That Congress directly authorized offensive military action. In other words, one of the first and last times in recent history an official request for military action has been taken to Congress and passed. Iraq was sanctioned for 6 months prior to military action, economic sanctions. Okay, so this wasn't just instantly jumping in there. There was a period where the world was trying to see if these economic sanctions would take hold. So what does this show? World opinion was almost unanimous that Iraq had violated international law, and the majority of member states saw themselves as within legal right to wage war on Iraq. In the United States, care was taken to gain congressional approval and support through constitutional process and allowed time for these economic sanctions before justifying military action. If you recall, quite a large amount of Americans were supportive of this effort. They were worried about it, but they were supportive of it. But there also were, as there always are in any sort of war in the United States, there were people who were not in favor, obviously, okay? The coalition, this is really important. The U.S. forged a coalition of allies, over 35 nations. This was the largest coalition of nations since World War II. We may never see anything like it again. I don't know. Look at these nations: UK, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, South Korea, Argentina, Czechoslovakia, Greece, all of these. But what was the most important was getting the Arab nations on board. Kuwait, obviously, they were going to support it, and so was Saudi Arabia. The Kuwaitis had a military in exile. They had, remember, a government in exile at this time. Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, Syria, UAE, Pakistan, quite a few others. So we'll talk about why this is extremely important. The U.S. history of wars, though, one of the things I want to underline here, though, when you think about the conflicts that we have been most successful in, they have usually been because we've been involved with a large coalition, a large alliance of other nations. World War I, World War II. Conflicts where we have historically had a smaller alliance of support, or we've tried to go it alone, less success, okay? Why was this important? Why was it important to have all of these Arab nations on board? Well, Hussein, when he invaded Kuwait, he tried to also paint this as this was a war against the West. Arab nations against the West. He decides to amp this up by picking on the perennial favorite in the Middle East for most of the Arab nations, their scapegoat. What nation is that?
Israel.
Israel, okay? He says this is Israel manipulating the United States, and it was extremely important that we had these Arab nations on board. They were threatened by Hussein. They were threatened by his Ba'athist regime in Iraq. They weren't happy with this aggression. So this took some very careful diplomacy that we'll talk about later. But to have all of these Arab nations on board was extremely lucky. Some political analysts today even believe that we should have probably invested more in that Arab coalition. That if possibly after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, we had invested in that Arab coalition, it might have created more stability in the region. In other words, even with Hussein's regime still being in power, but much more neutered now, they could have kept him in check as an organization. That's one of those what if type of things. We don't know. We don't even know if that Arab coalition would have stayed together. But an interesting thought. Okay, Desert Shield. This has become sort of the blueprint for logistics, because what happened here was absolutely amazing. The first thing was, as I mentioned, Bush needs to get some sort of force in there right away in order to deter further Iraqi invasion from pushing into Saudi Arabia. 82nd Airborne, if any of you are veterans of the 82nd Airborne and participated in this, I feel sorry for you guys, because you were put out there in the desert, you were digging foxholes, and basically I've talked to a couple of veterans that said we're basically going to be a speed bump if Hussein decides to come over the border into Saudi Arabia, because Hussein has got a very armor-heavy military, massive military of tanks, massive military of armored personnel carriers, all of this kind of stuff. Airborne units, of course, very light. They did send 51 of these M551 Sheridan tanks, but if any of you have had any history with these, you know these things were pretty much worthless against larger armor. So, but at least it was a deterrent. It was out there, we had made our presence known, and it actually was, it was a success in proving how the rapid deployment force would operate. They were able to get out there within record time. Hussein could have taken advantage of this. That probably would have been the best time for him to have moved into Saudi Arabia, because there wouldn't have been a lot we could have done. But what does he do? He sits on his thumbs kind of hoping that more Arab support will come his way and that he can continue to use propaganda to break this coalition up. So he missed kind of a window of opportunity there. The logistics that were brought in here is, again, as I mentioned, a blueprint for how to successfully move a massive army. And a lot of it was due to this gentleman right here. There's a great book. I highly recommend it. I've got it over here. Moving Mountains. Lieutenant General, later Major General, William G. Pagonis was General Norman Schwarzkopf's chief logistics officer. He was the very first American to set down in Saudi Arabia in advance of the U.S. troops. He immediately started accessing the port facilities. One of the things that helped us out a lot is in the Gulf, there are some outstanding port facilities. Daman, Bahrain, Qatar. He started using Naval Supply Systems Command, Military Sea Lift Command, immediately tapped into over 576 ships to move all of this material, supplies, weapons, ammunition, everything that was needed, construction material, troops. You're familiar with ro-ros. I'm sure some of you are, been in the Navy. Roll on, roll off. So these are ships where you don't have to waste time with craning cargo overboard. You pull up to the dock, everything rolls off, and if you need to put stuff back on, it rolls on. And of course, he also took advantage of the airlift capacity too. So we, as you know, in the Air Force still today, we have these amazing aircraft, cargo aircraft, C-5 Galaxy, C-141, C-130s, 10,000 aircraft movements, moved over 465 tons of supplies, okay? But even better than that is what he was able to accomplish within these few months. 4 million tons of equipment supplies moved in to the region. 240,000 initial personnel, a 60-day supply buffer. That means that if for some reason we're absolutely cut off and we could not get further logistics in, there is still 2 months worth of supplies to support the military there. Created KKMC, some of you might know if you're veterans, that was King Khalid military city, an entire city that was built. Riyadh, KFIA, Dhahran, other bases or cities. Many of these were built by U.S. Navy Seabees. A little shout out to the Seabees there.
Who paid for it?
Who paid for it? The United States government. Yeah. Some of these countries also chipped in too. Yeah. Some of them did. Overall, this created something basically the size of Seattle, Washington, as far as all of the personnel utilities, and support services. Some of these bases would actually become permanent bases later in the region, and that was controversial, as some of you know. Why was this important? How was it successful? It became a model of a rapid deployment of an entire modern army to a distant theater. So we had these exercises during the Cold War. Some of you are familiar with Reforger in Europe. Some of you are familiar with Bright Star, which took place in Egypt. This was the idea of, if we have to go to war back in the 70s and 80s, late 70s and 80s, how can we move a massive force, not just an RDF, but a massive force or an army over there? And we had these exercises, so it bore fruit. It showed that we could do this. Throughout the entire 10-year period, just for comparison, in Vietnam, about 10 years in Vietnam, 17 million tons were shipped plus 750,000 by air. At the height of the Vietnam War, April 1969, there were around 549,000 personnel, but it took about 4 years to build that up. By comparison, almost 700,000 U.S. troops and support were built up in the Saudi Arabian theater in about 5 months. Okay. You can take a look at this Army deployment comparisons, this chart, first 30 days, first 60 days, first 90 days, going all the way back to World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia here, as far as tons of supplies and equipment. This was a miracle. It really was. The buildup to take place to support a force like this happening so quickly. Almost 700,000 troops and support, and about a third of those were reservists and National Guard units. And we'll talk about that here in a minute too. We'll touch on that. Let's talk about the leadership we had during this time. Okay. As we know, of course, President George H.W. Bush. We had Dick Cheney, Secretary of State. Colin Powell over there on his right. And Powell, of course, was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Some of you Air Force guys know General Chuck Horner, right? And then, of course, we had, in charge of the theater there was General, anybody remember his nickname? Norman. He also went by another one, too, the Bear. Yeah, too. So, yep.
Yeah, he took it from me.
He stole it from our very own Bear. Yeah.
He stole it from me.
Yep. Trusting the military leadership. So many of these guys, Schwarzkopf, of course, himself, Colin Powell, we take a look at even George H.W. Bush. Remember, he was a very highly regarded World War II veteran. But the vast majority of these guys were Vietnam veterans. Tommy Franks, Fred Franks, Chuck Horner, as we mentioned, Barry McCaffrey, Walter Boomer, he was the Marine Corps general. These guys had made a pledge. When this war was going to happen, they were not going to see the same mistakes repeated as were repeated in Vietnam. To have a huge high command that had that mentality and had the experience also from having been in Vietnam was a huge advantage. Also, the Bush-Cheney-Powell, the political team back in Washington, D.C., operated for the most part with a hands-off policy. They enabled Schwarzkopf to conduct the war with his generals without constant interference or questioning from Washington, D.C. So he was given that freedom, which many people believe that during the Vietnam War, the generals did not have. Schwarzkopf, definitely the right man. There's been, I know, in retrospect, there's been some criticism of the guy since I think he passed away about 5 or 6 years ago. And I always thought he was an incredible individual, but I have heard some criticism pop up about the way he handled things. But we have to remember that what we were looking for here as far as a leader of this entire endeavor was a gentleman that was going to have to be more of a diplomat. So he was going to have to be more of kind of like the Eisenhower type than the Patton type. Although there were parts of his personality that are certainly similar to George Patton. But he had to be very diplomatic. Think about that. He's working with the Joint Force Command, the coalition. He's working with a lot of different nations here, an alliance of nations. So just like Eisenhower during World War II, to have those skills and be more of a diplomatic general, definitely a good idea. And there he is, of course, when he was a Special Forces military advisor in Vietnam back in the day. Have you ever seen photographs of him working with some of the South Vietnamese soldiers? he was huge. I mean, you know, the South Vietnamese kind of smaller people, and he was towering over them because I think he was 6'3". I think that was a pretty big guy. These lessons that were learned, that these generals put into place and that the political leadership allowed from Vietnam, military, not political leadership of the forces, having well-defined mission and goals, avoiding that micromanagement from politicians, and given the freedom to execute those goals. Unified Air Command. Instead of the restrictive air campaigns in Vietnam, the leaders established a single manager for air operations and came up with a cohesive strategy. We'll talk about that strategy. Overwhelming force, the Powell Doctrine. Other countries, I remember the British described this during Desert Storm as, you Yanks like to go to war with like a sledgehammer on a peanut. That's kind of the way they said it, was like cracking a peanut. But this was to use that decisive, overwhelming force that we have to achieve victory quickly instead of a gradual escalation that kind of leads to these, you know, forever type conflicts. Clear objectives and getting public support. Define these attainable goals. Secure the backing of the American public and Congress. Stark contrast to some of the unsupported goals of the Vietnam War. Operational security, strict control of information and the media. And we'll talk a little about that also, too, because that had some good and bad to it. General Charles Horner, the gentleman we mentioned for the Air Force, summed this all up and claimed that 100% of the success in Desert Storm was based on the lessons learned in Vietnam. So now, the leadership, taking a look at the military forces we had during this time. Now, I'm a little biased, but I tend to believe that we had probably the best military in the history of our nation in 1990. And again, I'm biased, so you know we can argue that all we want. But what was going on here had been, in a large part, as a reaction to post-Vietnam, and the restructuring of our military. There's just a couple examples of what was going on, but there was a lot going on here in the late 70s and the early 80s. The Strategic Modernization Program in '81, President Reagan brought out a massive overhaul of conventional and nuclear forces, remember, investing a lot more money to meet the resurgent Soviet threat. Remember, the Soviets in the 80s were starting to pop back up on the Cold War radar as a huge threat. There was the invasion of Afghanistan. There was the problems in Poland going on, suppression of Poland. There was also the shooting down of the Korean airliner, as some of you may recall that. So the Soviet Union is raising its head as another threat again, and Reagan was right on the ball with getting a lot of our military geared towards this threat. Goldwater-Nichols Act recognized the Department of Defense reduce inter-service rivalry, improve operational efficiency by placing power in joint commands. TRADOC, training doctrine, training and enlistment acceptance standards increased in the post-Vietnam military. The all-volunteer force was small, but very professional. Pay had been improved, zero tolerance on drug usage. It had improved the quality and performance of the U.S. military. By 1982, 86% of recruits had a high school diploma. And it was, remember these advertisements? Be all you can be. So a lot of this kind of, if you will, marketing of the military as a career for young people. And that's what got me. You know, during the 80s, it was a kind of this resurgence of being proud of our military, this patriotism, and that was one of the reasons why I enlisted, to tell you the truth. And I give a lot of credit to Ronald Reagan for that. So why was this important? How was it successful? Well, the size of the all-volunteer force was at its highest level following Vietnam. Remember, in Vietnam, though, we had a lot of draft. We had the draft going on. And since then has unfortunately declined. So if you take a look at this green line here, newly enlisted individuals here, and you'll take a look at 1990 here, you'll see that it has steadily kind of fallen over the years from where we had a peak in 1990. The quality of the armed forces were arguably at its highest level. We had some of the most educated, some of the most professional people. The numbers, standards, the training practices, support services, professionalism, and pay was at some of its highest. So we have this incredible force, but remember, as a part of that, we also have the reserves, the National Guard. So we have total force concept came about. Utilizing reservists, National Guard is nothing new. Our military has done it for many, many years. But during the first Gulf War, there had been this philosophy of total force, of absolutely integrating National Guard, reserve, and active duty components, putting them in to these almost like pieces of a puzzle, where they fit best for support and where they fit best for what they considered round out units within the active regular duty Army, okay? This improved efficiency, it reduced costs. Over 188,000 U.S. military personnel who were deployed to the Gulf were Guard and reservists. Thousands of citizen soldiers left their civilian careers to support the operation, marking a shift toward greater reliance on reserves. Air Force Reserve, National Guard provided 50% of strategic airlift crews, 33% of aeromedical evacuation crews. Army Reserve National Guard, 85% of the Army's chemical decontamination units, 70% of the railway units, medical, civil affairs, logistics personnel, field artillery, military police, transportation, etc. Now there was something going on here, I remember, where there's this comparison of civilian soldiers and the skills that they brought into the reserve component. And that was this kind of philosophy of if you do it in the civilian life, and then you carry it forward into the military at a time when there is a war or whatever, what kind of experience or background do you carry with you that benefits the force entirely? And this is where I'm talking about people like a dentist, who in the civilian world, a dentist, who's also a reserve medical officer and a dentist in the military. And in that aspect, you take a look at that kind of experience they bring in. A truck driver, a civilian truck driver who is also a reservist and drives trucks in the military. You know, there were stories about these guys when a truck broke down. Some of the active duty personnel didn't exactly know what to do, what forms to fill out and everything like that. And there was one of these reservists, an older guy who had driven trucks most of his life, and he says, you just do this. You stick a piece of bubble gum in there and a hairpin and it's fixed, you know. So there was that kind of background, though, that really paid off with some of these units. At the same time, there was some problems with this, too. Integrating many of these civilian soldiers, there was issues with deployability. There was definitely controversy about how prepared they were. The Roundout Brigade issue especially, I was involved in a little bit of that out at the NTC. We had a National Guard unit out there that was supposed to be the Roundout Brigade for the 24th Infantry Division. And they did not perform very well out at the National Training Center. More about the National Training Center coming up here. Yes, you Navy flyers and you Air Force flyers and your pilots, Top Gun, Red Flag. These were schools, if you will, that were formed after the Vietnam War to help with the performance of Navy fighter pilots. And the only reason I'm bringing this up, I know this is a very, very specific type of thing here, was because of the mentality here, what it started. And the mentality that was started in the late 70s and moving into the 80s was in order to train our force to the best ability, we have to simulate the conditions they will be under in war. The better we are at simulating those conditions that they will be in warfare, the better they're going to perform. And I think Desert Storm absolutely bore that out in proof. So the National Training Center was kind of a similar concept taken to the ground forces. And this was where, as you guys are familiar with Top Gun and Red Flag, we had aircraft that were flying against American aircraft, but the American aircraft were an opposition force. They were using tactics that the Soviets would use. And so the idea was you're doing these kind of mock dogfights, but they're as realistic as possible as far as how you are going to perform in these war games, so to speak. The NTC was the same thing on the ground. We had built an OPFOR out there in the Mojave Desert that absolutely copied the doctrine, tactics, and strategy of the Soviet Army. And they had gotten this down so well. I remember talking to some of the guys. I worked pretty closely with the 177th. They were the brigade that was there that played the op for. They had taken these old tanks and they had modified them. They were called Viz mods. They had put these kind of fiberglass shells on them so they looked like T-72s, Soviet T-72s, BMPs, this kind of thing. They had helicopters flying around, supposed to duplicate Soviet helicopters. They had the Miles system, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, where the lights would go off if the target was hit. So you weren't using real munitions and everything, but this was about as close as you could get to it. And the forces that would go through rotations in the National Training Center were taught. Basically, you go through it as if they were going through war. Everything from getting ready, preparing movement, transportation to the National Training Center in California was taken on as if their unit was going to war. They took it that seriously. Out in the desert, the opposition force there usually won about 9 out of the 10 mock battles, but that was good. To lose those battles was a learning opportunity. And you want to lose them in a safe environment like this, right, instead of when you get to the real battlefield. And that was one of the things that had come out of World War II, is what we based this philosophy on was the fact that if a green combat soldier or pilot or sailor or whoever goes into war and they survive the first couple of combat encounters, they stand a better chance of surviving, learning, and becoming a more efficient warrior. So let's duplicate those first initial combat encounters in these mock environments like Top Gun or the NTC, and then our troops will hit the ground running. There was also the work of somebody here by the name of John A. Worden III. He was an Air Force colonel who has gone down in history to be known as probably one of the most preeminent Air Force strategic thinkers since like Curtis LeMay, Billy Mitchell, these type of people. Because what he came up with, Project Checkmate, was the idea of the air-land battle being history. The air-land battle is what we saw in World War II. The Air Force, our air assets, strategic bombing is there to support the ground forces. Worden, in the 1980s, the late 70s, early 80s, flipped this completely around. And he said our air assets should be striking first in a war. Because a modern day military, an enemy military, is a system. If you destroy that system first from the air, then the ground forces won't have much of a fight moving in. You destroy that system by taking out their anti-aircraft capability, their command and communication, all their communication. You blind them, basically. You destroy that ability, and then you move the forces in. So it's kind of turning this around, and that would pay dividends during Desert Storm, as we know.
Isn't that similar to what Israel did in the 67 war?
Yes.
Six-Day War. Okay.
And that's where some of that philosophy came from.
Okay.
Very good, very good.
Because they took out the anti-Israeli air bases or
Yes.
everything first.
And they had a lot of their aircraft on the ground too, which is like we did here at Desert Storm. So this training that has been going on throughout the 80s of our total force, why was this so important with the first Gulf War? Well, that was because the Iraqi military, Saddam Hussein, basically played right into our hands. Think about this for a second. The Iraqi military is using Soviet equipment. What have we been training against for decades? Soviet equipment. They're using Soviet doctrine, tactics. What have we been training against? Soviet doctrine and tactics. For crying out loud, they're in a desert. Where have we been training? In a desert, you know? So it would almost be as if, you know, you're playing football, that rival team. You had a copy of their playbook that you stole. You had their home field that you had played on for many, many, many years. And for years and years, you would study all of their tactics in football. Yeah, I mean, in the words of more than one soldier, I heard this from many, so that's why I paraphrase it here. I didn't put it into one direct quote from one individual. The person that we hear from in 2 weeks will probably say the same thing, Chris Hedenskog. It, meaning the war, Desert Storm, wasn't as hard as the easiest day at the NTC. the OP-4 was far tougher than Saddam's army. So being prepared like that, yeah. Admittedly, though, there is the truth. We may never, again, be so lucky as to have to fight an enemy force that absolutely plays into our hands like Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces did that time. Strategy, tactics, doctrine must continuously evolve and be taught to our forces. Know your enemy and how he fights. And you've probably heard this quote before, you go to war with the force you have. True, but that's not an excuse for not being as prepared as possible for the next war. Giving our troops the best training, retention incentives for good troops, the best weaponry equipment, and support that money can buy. For the United States, this is quite a task. As we know, it costs a lot of money. That's true. It costs a huge amount of our budget. I think it was 33% in World War II alone. And remember that the United States, we have this kind of role in the world right now where we have to train for almost any inevitability. We could be fighting 2 wars at once. We could be fighting an insurgency. We could be fighting a conventional conflict like Desert Storm or even nuclear war. So we have to be prepared for all of it and have our forces prepared for all of it. And that is tough, no doubt. So again, I will touch on what happened during the Desert Storm, Desert Saber, the operation in order to evict Iraq from Kuwait. But I love this quote from Colin Powell, and I think it summarizes the war perfectly. Our strategy in going after this army is very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it. And that's basically what we did. January 17th, the air war portion started. This was a massive 5-week air campaign based on this philosophy of John Warden. Going after the anti-air defense system, that was neutralized. Command and communications taking out. Logistics, stealth aircraft, cruise missiles, precision munitions were used to destroy much of Baghdad's war-making infrastructure. Later strikes would carpet bomb B-52s that were carpet bombing these entrenchments where the Iraqi soldiers were, horribly demoralize them, okay, as you can imagine. Pinpoint targets then later on armor, installation, bridges, vehicles, Scud missile launchers, and airfields. So as Warden had said, this is a system. You cripple this system, you destroy this system, and your enemy is going to be absolutely blind, fumbling around. It doesn't matter kind of what forces they have left, they're going to be absolutely inefficient. Some of you remember those scenes on CNN, remember? Watching all the tracer fire go up over Baghdad. The Iraqi Air Force, it was interesting because about 2/3 of the aircraft, the pilots fled to Iran, their enemy. And what was kind of, a mistake about doing that if you're an Iraqi pilot was the Iranians kept the pilots and the planes. As far as we know, they still have them. Now, they probably are, pieces of junk, but just, bringing that into the situation with Iran right now, they have some of these Iraqi aircraft. Another large portion of the Iraqi aircraft were buried in the sand. Not exactly sure what they were thinking there. I guess Hussein thought he could use them later. But the vast majority of them were destroyed in the air or destroyed on ground. This is where Top Gun, red flag, absolutely paid off. You hear these stories about fighter pilots, Air Force, Navy fighter pilots going in and just having a heyday taking out these Iraqi MiGs. Iraq retaliated, if you recall, shortly after we started the air campaign by firing Scud missiles. Now, these were horribly inaccurate missiles. They fired them at Israel and Saudi Arabia. We know there was a lot of diplomacy that had to take place here in order to keep Israel out of the war. Does anybody remember what the fear was if Israel decided to jump into this war?
Lose the entire coalition of Muslim countries.
Exactly. The coalition of Muslim countries would say, remember, Israel's their traditional enemy. Oh, this is really, Hussein's right. This is really an Israeli-backed effort. So there was a lot of very careful, excellent diplomacy that was done. Remember, Patriot missile batteries were sent to Israel, and that helped, of course, mitigate some of this effect. The Battle of Khafji. This was a very short operation. Hussein decided to move in. Some people say it was kind of a test. Mechanized forces moved into this border town on Kuwait and Saudi Arabia called Kafji. Mainly it was Qatari forces who fought there, but U.S. Marines were also involved, and they brought down a lot of air power, a lot of airstrikes, and a lot of artillery strikes. The Iraqi army had nothing like that. They were just basically targets. Very quickly, because their command and control had been obliterated, they just become targets on the ground. So this was a blind attack, and it kind of gave Schwarzkopf this feeling of, well, we don't have to worry too much about any of Hussein's offensive capabilities. Defensive, we still haven't kind of figured them out, but if this is the measure of the Iraqi army and this is where they're at, not too much to worry about here. The mother of the battles, mother of all battles. You remember Hussein saying that. Well, the Iraqi command believed that this was, in their mind, they had always thought this war was going to be like the Iran-Iraq war. It was going to be this grinding war of attrition with these American forces. They were so out of their league in understanding modern warfare. And that was the problem here. You might remember one of my favorite quotes from Schwarzkopf. As far as Saddam Hussein being a great military strategist, he is neither a strategist, nor is he schooled in the operational arts, nor is he a tactician, nor is he a general, nor is he a soldier. Other than that, he's a great military man. I want you to know that. February 24th, 27th, ground offensive began after we had done this 5-week air campaign. Within 100 hours, coalition forces had knocked Iraqi forces reeling from Kuwait and advanced deep into Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi conscripts who were demoralized by this carpet bombing were just out there surrendering in droves. You probably remember the video footage on the news. There was really little actual resistance from these initial elements, these conscripted soldiers, except mass surrender. They found out that they had had no support. They had very little food, very little water, very little protection, very little ammunition. These were propaganda leaflets. They were all over the place. They were also dropped on these troops. And there are many images you can find of troops waving these things as they're coming towards the coalition forces. The left hook, the famous left hook, or sometimes called the Hail Mary pass, that Schwarzkopf used here was also brilliant as far as an overall strategy here, going out as far into the desert here as possible. This was an area that Iraq believed no modern forces could operate. And in fact, we had positioned forces out there. We'd gone through the berms, and in no time our forces were moving almost like ships on the ocean, like battleships, like warships, in these massive divisional movements, and really not having much trouble with that area at all, because we had pre-positioned supplies. We had pre-positioned transport units and support units that were going to follow these attacking divisions as they head up. So they weren't going to be stuck out in the middle of the desert with nothing. As you can see, the first advance going in here, Marine units going in here with the Arab coalition forces to liberate Kuwait. There was also a little bit of a false action out here in the Persian Gulf by some Marines, and that kept a lot of the Iraqi forces in Kuwait thinking there was going to be an amphibious attack, which there never was. But we played it up so that a lot of their attention was over here into the Gulf. The second stage of that then was turning here to cut off Kuwait. And that's when we encountered the Republican Guard forces. And that's when there was more fighting. These were soldiers who were much more committed. They were much more professional to the regime in Baghdad. And they were going to put up a fight. Yes. And when they made contact with these Republican Guard units, the Tawakana, Medina, Hammurabi, who were screening this area in Kuwait, there occurred some particularly intense combat. 73 Easting, Medina Ridge, Norfolk, the British were involved in that. However, our superior tactics and training, weapons and optics, range, surprise, coordination, GPS, of course, air support, all of this technology, all of this training, all of this force comes to a head here, and we rapidly advanced and steamrolled through many of these Republican Guard divisions. There was some intense combat there, though, and I hope that you will be here in 2 weeks to hear from somebody who was in the middle of it, Chris Hedenskog, who has a great story to tell about 73 Easting and his participation in that. 27th, 28th of February, Iraqi forces were fleeing from Kuwait up Highway 80. And as you know, they were decimated by airstrikes. The scenes were pretty brutal. Not seen since some of you World War II aficionados, you may know about the Falaise Gap in Normandy, where we had captured a German unit, had cornered it, and then airstrikes and artillery strikes had just decimated that German unit. It couldn't escape. And we hadn't seen scenes like that since this occurred in World War II. And we're seeing scenes, in 1991 of the highway, of these vehicles that had just been demolished by airstrikes, bodies everywhere. But we have to remember a couple of things. This was very controversial. These images got out in media, and there was this feeling amongst the world community that at this point, the Iraqis have left Kuwait and we're just committing slaughter. But you have to recall that there was no overture from Iraq at this point for peace talks. This was a continuing war. And that these forces that were fleeing Kuwait could just as easily be rallied, turned around on that far western part and used against us. So they were still, in fact, a legitimate target. But the controversy stems there, and many people do believe that it was these images that got to the Bush administration where he was going to say, okay, we've accomplished our objective here of getting Iraq out of Kuwait. Now it's time to start saying, let's pressure Hussein to come to a truce agreement. February 28th, today, 35 years ago, Bush ordered a halt in the advance and Hussein was forced into a temporary ceasefire agreement. He accepted the terms to end the war, recognition of Kuwaiti sovereignty, dismantling any WMDs, and submitting to no-fly zones in the north and south of Iraq. As we know, Hussein had his soldiers set nearly 1,000 oil fields on fire. Some people felt this was just revenge, retribution. There actually was a strategy behind this. The idea was in the waning part of the war, he was trying to obscure with as much smoke as he could his forces from any sort of aerial attack, any sort of airstrikes, anything like that. But the environmental damage that this caused, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, the effect it had on people was horrendous.
Were they all Kuwaiti oil fields that he split?
Kuwaiti, yeah. Mm-hmm. And if you recall the original estimates, they said when this was going on, this environmental catastrophe was, they said it would take probably a decade to put out all these fires. And absolutely tapping into United States firefighters and also those around the world, some incredible teams, some incredible work was done. And within, I think it was about 9 months, actually, all these fires had been shut down. So far exceeded.
At that time, Red Adair
was one of them. Yeah.
one of the only group that could put
Right.
out an
Right.
oil well fire.
Right.
But because of this, other groups were formed and
Yeah.
were successful.
Yeah, from other countries and everything like that. But Red Adair, yeah, his organization took the brunt of it for sure. And he was one of the first over there who shut down these fires because of the experience he had in Texas with many fires there.
If we had been so successful through March or until March in getting them to come to the table to create peace.
For a truce.
How is it that they had the people to set the refineries on fire?
This was going on not just at the end there. It had been going on even prior to that. But it was still going on even after the truce.
But how did they get in there? I'm just saying, if we didn't secure it as good as we should have.
Probably not. Yeah, yeah. There was still what would be called sabotage, in bigger terms. But many of these had been started even before we had control of that area.
Did they know
So,
who? I mean, obviously them, but how or?
yeah, Iraqi soldiers. Yeah.
While they were
They had
retreating.
access, okay.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of it was while they're retreating, but some had even started before they retreated too. Because again, it was seen as a strategy too as well. The immediate aftermath. Well, remember we talked about there being almost 900,000 coalition forces, okay? 292 coalition deaths. 776 wounded. That is an infinitesimal portion of the military that was involved. Of course, it was extremely tragic for those families of those 292. But when you take a look at casualties from other wars, absolutely remarkable. There were estimated to be about 50,000 Iraqi fatalities, over 170,000 captured. Like many of these wars, we don't know the exact numbers. The Iraqi government at the time was never really very forthcoming with exact numbers. One of the sad things that occurred, and you'll be able to talk to Chris a little bit about this if you're here in 2 weeks, because he witnessed it, was during this time of the ceasefire, the Shiite minority had sort of gotten the idea that this was the perfect opportunity to rise up against Hussein and his regime. We were not allowed to interfere in any of this. And unfortunately, Hussein was able to use whatever he still had left of his Republican Guard, chemical weapons, to put down these uprisings. In the north, there was also Kurdish people who rose up as well. So they had kind of misinterpreted, or you could say interpreted, this signal that this was the end of the Hussein regime and they were going to jump on board, only in many ways to have had absolutely no support from the coalition. Chris will even tell you stories of, how sad this was to be watching a village that was getting bombed by Hussein's helicopters dropping chemical weapons on men and women and children, and they couldn't do anything about it. So, because it would have violated the terms of the ceasefire. This raises an interesting question, though. Hussein never did unleash this chemical attack with chemical weapons. Okay, I remember, in those of you who served in the military during that time, extensive MOP training that we did, right? All this gear that we had to wear, and the forces went in when they invaded Iraq wearing all of this uncomfortable gear with the belief that he could release chemical weapons. Now, why do you suppose he did not release these chemical weapons against the coalition?
Obviously, his troops were ready.
Yeah. Other reasons?
I didn't hear what he said.
A little louder, Ken.
Oh, I just assumed his troops were not trained
Right.
in chemical warfare. Not unable, they would have been decimated.
That's part of it, yeah. And they didn't have the chemical protection like we did, too, yeah.
Probably didn't want to take those gloves off.
Yeah, that's another part of it, too. Think of how the United States and Israel would have then reacted to that, yeah. But I agree with you, too, Ken. I mean, Iraqi soldiers didn't have protective gear, And remember, they're in a defensive position. So if they're going to use any of this stuff, it's going to come back on them. But he never really did. And thank goodness, as far as I'm concerned.
As extensive chemical weapon inventory as we thought he did.
That too. He didn't have what we would call, remember there still is this big debate, and I don't want to dive too far into it, but of what is the definition of a weapon of mass destruction. Chemical weapons, certainly, they destroy human lives en masse. But like you said, how much of this huge amount of weapons of mass destruction he had has always been subject to, controversy. Post-Gulf War, and I'll get to your question here in just a second, and this rings this question again, and that's why I want to get into this. Was this really America's most successful war? Well, with everything I've told you here, you could say you could definitely make a case for it. But no war is perfect, and we know that because war in general is a tragedy. It's always a sign of a breakdown in humanity, right? And there certainly were issues afterwards. One of the things that I always felt kind of uncomfortable about were these ultra-patriotic parades that we had right after the war. But the one thing I was very happy to see was when they established these parades and celebrations, they also included the Vietnam veterans. And I saw many Vietnam veterans marching in this, and I remember many of the people for the Ticker Tape parade that was in D.C., the one that was in New York City, they said the Vietnam veterans are going to march with this because they never got that homecoming like the Gulf War veterans are getting, and they should have that. And so they included them. Press coverage during the first Gulf War. We know for a fact that the conflict was short. It was very difficult for the press to cover it. The dominance of air war, too. You can't go all the way out to Baghdad if you're CNN or reporters or whatever and follow the military out there. It was carefully controlled. Some people would say even to the point of censorship. We had these press pools where basically reporters would cover, remember these press conferences that Schwarzkopf would have, and you would bring in some of his generals and they would show some of the video of airstrikes and everything like that. It brought up a lot of concerns about what freedom and rights the press does have to cover a war. And we know that's still a huge controversy that's been going on since wartime. But one of the problems with this...
One thing that sticks in my mind was Schwarzkopf's press conference where he showed the footage from the laser designator aircraft of the pickup truck crossing the bridge, and he
Yeah.
said, this gentleman is ladies and gentlemen, is the luckiest
Right.
pickup truck driver in Iraq.
Because imagine what he saw in his rearview mirror. Remember? Yeah, when that bridge was taken out. Yep. But the problem with that, though, one of the problems was that because of the system with the press and handling them so tightly and controlled, is it led people to believe that this war was not a real war, that it was bloodless and it was effortless. And as, like I said, I think you will learn from Chris when he speaks in 2 weeks. There was much more here that you never saw in the press because later on, remember, they had embedded reporters in the 2003 invasion, and they were able to actually go in with the troops. And that was controversial, too. There was some questions about objectivity, etc. But it came to be known as a Nintendo war because of those videos. Another thing was a high number of friendly fatalities, friendly fire fatalities came out. And those weren't revealed to the public until much later. Unfinished business. So this is the part that, of course, is extremely controversial. The question always comes up. Could we have avoided the war in 2003 if we had gone in and finished the job in 1991? Well, you have to recall that was not the mission. In 1991, the mission that had been established by the UN and the mission that we had sold the United States public and Congress was that we were going in to evict Iraq from Kuwait. Going all the way into Baghdad and regime change, whole different animal. And as we know in 2003, that came out. I'm not going to get into the controversy about that because everybody has their own opinions. Should we have? Should we have? There is some belief that the situation could have been handled without going in 2003 because, again, as I mentioned, if the Arab nations had been kept as a strong coalition, they probably could have kept a check on Hussein. Hussein was not a good person. We know that. He would have had to have been removed eventually. But to do another invasion in 2003 where there were far more casualties and then we were stuck in Iraq for over 10 years. We still are there. A lot of people don't know we still have forces in Iraq right now. And then all of the destabilization that took place in that part of the world, thousands of deaths, I think it was over 4,000 or so who've been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, these forever wars, that kind of thing. And part of that too was our military got a little blinded by Desert Storm. Coming out of this massive victory, and it was a conventional victory, I think for a while there, our military leadership lost focus that you can still be involved in these unconventional wars in the world. And especially now when we feel that we're the world policemen, you know, after Desert Storm, the New World Order, remember that? And that we should go out there and get involved in all these conflicts. Well, some of these conflicts were a rude awakening after Desert Storm. Bosnia, Somalia, remember Mogadishu, Black Hawk Down, Afghanistan, of course, after 9/11, and Iraq again. So this argument is still going on today as to whether he should have been removed in 1991, whether that would have saved us 2003, or what. Last thing I kind of want to touch on here is another aspect of Desert Storm that came out. Again, it wasn't perfect, and that was the Gulf War illness. Shortly after returning from the Gulf, we know many veterans complained of symptoms. It has affected 25 to 33% of veterans. The initial attitude by the government was what the problem was. They wanted to dismiss it instead of investigating it further. It took many, many years, not until hearings before Congress in 1996, and the VA now approves claims and it recognizes Gulf War illness as a chronic multi-symptom illness. The origins have been kind of narrowed down. There was a lot of mystery about where it came from, but most of it has been handed off to all of this horrible stuff that was in the air at the time, including sarin gas. So chemical weapons that had been destroyed by the United States Air Force and had been released into the air. And there were many troops who were affected by just enough of that to cause these issues. But there was so much junk in the air at that time, pesticides, the smoke from the oil wells, that to think that our troops wouldn't come back with having some sort of reaction to these environmental factors was a little bit naive. Back there.
Gulf War illness now actually has a F code in the ICD-10, so you can actually apply for VBA benefits under that.
Yep, thank goodness, right? Yeah. Iraq today, we know there's problems. There was attempts at democracy which have struggled since 2003, since elections in 2004. We know there's still conflict between the Shiite, the Kurds, Sunni, Muslims, but also the lack of the government and control in certain areas led to organizations like Al-Qaeda in Iraq taking haven there for a while, ISIS taking haven there for a while. And it's still kind of a work in progress, but still very destabilized, as we know. So I know there was a couple of questions there, and I wanted to hit up just a few of those real quickly. But again, what I wanted to show you guys is what this is as 35 years later, how we kind of put this into retrospect. It was not a perfect war. No war ever is. But I think the way we went about accomplishing what we did in the first Gulf War, if you have to fight a war, it was probably the best way to do it. And I think that seems to be kind of the general consensus. May we ever have those type of circumstances again? Who knows? But at that time and place, it was certainly the way to fight that war and the way to approach it. That's my personal opinion in that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. I'd like to add a few comments here. When the first Gulf War occurred, I was in the headquarters for the Corps Engineers in Washington, D.C., in the Military Programs Directorate. The Corps of Engineers is the contracting officer for the Department of Defense. We typically think our experience from World War II is you move into a country, you just take over this area, I want all this space, and I'm going to set up my cantonments and all that stuff. Well, in a non-open war type environment, moving into a sophisticated country, it doesn't work that way. We wanted to bring in hundreds of thousands of troops into Saudi Arabia to stage them, because we're going to move into Kuwait. The Saudis said, that's great. Come on in. How about talk with, Abdul over here, who's our big contractor who rents property. We'll rent you space. You'll pay for it. Oh, would you like water, trash pickup, other things that you may need, additional construction material, maybe some contractors to help you? Well, sure, you're going to have to pay for that. That means you're going to have contracts. This was a war. The whole prep was all done with contracts. And most of it had to be negotiated in advance by the Army Corps of Engineers, which was my group. I was part of that. So we had to send over a whole team set up in Saudi Arabia to manage all of that. And just so you know, all the bases we have throughout the Middle East and everywhere else, it's the same thing. They're not freebies. In many cases, initially, we're paying that particular country for the services we're going to provide them. Now, the State Department, that's where you have the good, sharp people who we've all gotten rid of now, who are going to negotiate to get you paid back for that. And, so we had to do all the design work, the contracting to, set this, I'm the one. after telling everyone.
If that's for me, tell them I'm here.
Let me just turn that. Okay.
It is for you.
I'm sorry. But anyway, but the interesting thing about this, eventually the Saudis did pay, reimburse us for it. And they did it with a check for, I think, $1.5 billion. Well, this was before you had the nice, electronic transition. So our boss, Major General Ray, who happened to be over at the time, was given a check by the Saudis. They scooted him over to, I don't know, either Bahrain or Dubai, because the French flew the Concorde out to there. And he flew back on the Concorde to the U.S. It wasn't a direct, it was to Paris and then to the U.S. because simply the savings, on the interest by bringing, being able to deposit that check, a day or two earlier made all the difference. But war now, particularly, as we're seeing Middle East and all this stuff, is conducted a lot differently than, we envisioned in the past. Yeah. Oh, yes. The Saudis were viewed as pretty dependable. No. But again, it just showed how different. The other big challenge we had very early on there was the impact of dust on turbine engines. We were having crashes early on when we first got out there with helicopters because as you kind of would come into land, you would lose all visibility. And if you weren't careful, you just kind of ran yourself right into the ground.
Not just the helicopters. You have to ask Chris when he's here in 2 weeks about taking the pack filters out of the M1 Abrams and cleaning those.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, the Corps, again, was tasked to come up with a variety of ways to suppress it. And a part of our research groups, we did come up with about 4 different ways. One of them was just an acrylic type of powder that you could mix almost with water and some other stuff, spray it, and it would harden up enough to kind of suppress things. The other thing I was just going to comment is my older son, Chris, had 2 assignments at the NTC, the National Training Center. First one, he was part of the opposing forces. And he said it was a lot of fun because he was running around with tanks and all this stuff. And he said beating up on his classmates who were coming out because we had a lot to learn about fighting a multi-day campaign in an environment very dusty, dry, and temperatures up to 110 degrees. Armor, you can't even touch it. It can be so hot, much less being inside. But it was interesting, when he came back the second time, he was now part of the evaluators and stuff. And he said, well, he was surprised how much we had learned, from all of that. So anyway, I was trying to think. Yes.
You said that things have changed regarding the arrangements of the contracts and stuff. What is it like now?
Even more, well, it's even more sophisticated, except now you can do a lot electronically. When we were designing the initial cantonment areas, we had these marvelous pre-set plans that, if you wanted to build a cantonment, let's say for 1,000 troops, here's how you would do it, here's the bill of, the bill of materials, here's how you could contract. But it was all in writing. Now it's all electronic. And finally, toward the tail end, we would get the demands sent back to the U.S. electronically. We would develop the plans, the bill of materials, everything, and electronically send it back to them. But again, it's much different now.
Part of the way it's changed also, Mike, if you don't mind me interjecting, is the fact that you've also got competitive corporations out there that will do that kind of stuff, the military, and also other countries, too.
Yes.
So the Chinese, groups like this are also contracting now to have these, as we know, they have many ports that are built in East Africa and throughout the Indian Ocean and other parts of the world. So very kind of similar type of deal. But you're right, it's all about money.
Yeah, it's just a much different environment. Yes, James.
They almost went with capes because of
Well, I don't know. I doubt that. Yes, but anyway, yeah. Well, we passed up on the offer of using camels and all that kind of stuff. So
Although one of the contractors,
So-
and some of the Gulf veterans know this, there is a contractor out there by the Saudis called Camel Burgers. And it was a food truck that would come out to these places like KKMC and they would serve burgers. Yeah, what they were made of, that, yeah.
What about camel milk? There is such a thing as camel milk.
Might have had camel milk in a little blue bottle.
yeah. So anyway, but Don, thank you so much for the marvelous talk.